Picture this. It's 1963 central Turkey, a small town called Derinkuyu in the heart of Cappadocia. You're doing home renovations, maybe knocking out a wall to expand a room, something ordinary people do every day. You swing the sledgehammer, the plaster cracks, then the wall behind it gives way, and instead of finding another room or even solid rock, you find darkness, a passage, a tunnel carved into the stone leading down into nothing. You grab a flashlight. The beam disappears into the black. You take a step inside. The air is different here, cool, still, ancient. The tunnel opens into a room, then another, then a corridor branching in 3 directions. You keep walking deeper, and you realize this isn't some forgotten cellar or old storage space. This is something else entirely. Something vast. That's what happened to a local resident of Derinkuyu that year. He knocked through a wall, probably looking to make his house a little bigger, a little more comfortable. Instead, he uncovered an entire city. Not above ground, below it. Carved directly into the volcanic rock beneath his home, beneath his neighbors' homes, beneath the streets and shops and gardens of the whole town. A city that stretched down at least 8 levels, maybe more. Some estimates suggest as many as 17 or 18 stories underground, reaching depths of 250 feet or more. A subterranean metropolis capable of sheltering somewhere around 20,000 people, along with their livestock, their food stores, their water, their entire lives. For decades, the people of Derinkuyu had been walking over it, sleeping over it, building their modern lives on top of a hidden world that had been waiting in silence since 1923, when the region's Cappadocian, Greek and Armenian communities were forced to leave during the population exchange between Greece and Turkey. Those communities had known about the tunnels. They'd used them, sheltered in them during times of danger. But when they left, the knowledge left with them. The entrances were sealed or forgotten. The city beneath the city was abandoned. Until one man swung a sledgehammer and broke through. Now, if you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me in the comments, where are you right now and what time is it? I love checking in and seeing London at midnight, Los Angeles at bedtime, Tokyo at dawn, all listening together in the dark. Here's the thing that gets me about Derinkuyu. It's not just that it exists. Underground cities aren't unique. Humans have been digging shelters and storage caves for millennia. What's extraordinary is the scale, the ambition, the sheer stubbornness of it. When you stand in a building and realize there's an 18-story city beneath your feet, carved by hand into solid rock, you have to ask the question, what were they so afraid of that this seemed like the better option? Think about what it means to build downward instead of upward. To carve your refuge not into a mountain where you can see enemies approaching, but into the ground where you're blind, where every breath of air has to be engineered, where the only way out is the way you came in. This isn't a panic room. This isn't a storm shelter. This is a city designed for siege, for months or even years underground, with space for animals and grain and wine and worship, and life continuing in the dark while something terrible happened above. Derinkuyu is part of a broader network, over 200 underground settlements scattered across Cappadocia, at least 40 of them with 3 levels or more. Some are connected by tunnels stretching for miles through the bedrock. This wasn't a one-time project. This was a tradition, a way of life, passed down across centuries, maybe millennia. Dig when danger comes. Go deep. Wait it out. Survive. But what kind of danger makes an entire civilization choose the underworld over the surface? What threat is so persistent, so overwhelming, that generation after generation keeps returning to the tunnels, expanding them, refining them, teaching their children how to seal the rolling stone doors and ration the air from the ventilation shafts? That's the paradox we're here to unravel. The geology that made it possible, the empires that made it necessary, the faith that sustained people in the dark, and the waves of violence, invasion, and fear that kept driving them back underground, again and again, across more than 2,000 years. Because Derinkuyu isn't just an archaeological curiosity, it's a monument to human terror and human resilience carved into the same stone. And the deeper we go, the stranger the story becomes. Tens of millions of years ago, central Anatolia was a very different place. The African and Arabian tectonic plates were grinding northward, colliding with the Eurasian landmass, crumpling the crust, building mountain ranges. But they were also doing something else. They were creating weak points in the Earth's mantle, channels where molten rock could surge upward. And when it finally broke through, it didn't do so quietly. The volcanoes came first. Erciyes, Hasan, Gölüdağ, names that mean nothing to most people today, but mountains that once dominated the landscape of what would become Cappadocia. These weren't gentle, picturesque cones like Fuji. These were catastrophic systems, the kind that don't just erupt, they explode. Beginning roughly 10 million years ago, maybe earlier, they began a cycle of massive pyroclastic eruptions that would continue for millions of years. Picture what happens during one of these events. Deep beneath the volcano, magma superheated by the Earth's interior rises toward the surface. As it climbs, the pressure drops. Dissolved gases, water vapor, carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, they start coming out of solution. The magma foams like a shaken soda bottle, except this bottle is miles wide and the pressure is building toward the equivalent of thousands of nuclear weapons. When it finally blows, the explosion sends avalanches of gas and rock fragments roaring across the landscape at hundreds of miles per hour. These pyroclastic flows are among the most lethal phenomena in nature. They incinerate everything in their path, bury valleys under hundreds of feet of ash and pumice, and blanket the surrounding region in a thick, suffocating layer of volcanic debris. In Cappadocia, this happened again and again. Not once in a human lifetime, but across geological time. Eruptions separated by thousands or tens of thousands of years, each one adding another layer to the growing pile of volcanic material. Ash fell like snow, except it never melted. Pyroclastic flows swept across the plateau, filling every depression, smoothing every contour. Over time, the landscape became a geological layer cake, hundreds of meters thick in places, built from the compacted remains of ancient apocalypses. This is how tuff is born. The word itself comes from the Italian tufo, describing the volcanic rocks around Naples and Rome, regions that share Cappadocia's violent geological history. Tuff isn't a single rock type, it's a family, defined by one shared characteristic. It forms from volcanic ash and fragments that fall to earth while still hot, then compact under their own weight, fusing together into solid stone. But tuff has properties that make it almost unique among building materials. It's porous, full of tiny air pockets left by gas bubbles in the original ash. This makes it light, much less dense than granite or limestone. It's also relatively soft when freshly exposed, soft enough that bronze or even stone tools can carve it with patience. Ancient builders didn't need industrial equipment to work tuff. They needed time, determination, and the knowledge that the stone would cooperate. Here's the paradox built into the rock itself. Tuff is soft enough to carve, but strong enough to stand. When you first cut into it, the interior stone is workable, almost cooperative. But expose that surface to air, and something changes. The rock begins to harden, a process called induration, as moisture evaporates and minerals recrystallize. Give it weeks, months, years, and the carved surfaces become remarkably durable. Spaces hollowed out 1,000 years ago can remain stable today, supporting the weight of the rock above without collapsing. The people who would eventually carve Derinkuyu didn't invent this knowledge. They inherited it, learned it from the landscape itself, because Cappadocia had been teaching humans about tuff for millennia before the first underground city was dug. Every cliff face, every natural cave, every wind-carved hollow showed what the stone could do. Soft enough to erode into strange shapes, strong enough to stand as pillars and towers for geological ages. And what shapes? If you've ever seen photographs of Cappadocia, you know the landscape looks like something from another planet. Fairy chimneys, they're called. Tall conical spires of tuff capped with harder rock, standing in forest that stretch for miles. Honeycombed cliffs riddled with natural and human-carved openings. Deep valleys carved by rivers and wind into the soft volcanic rock, their walls glowing pink and white and ochre in the sun. The fairy chimneys formed through a slow process of differential erosion. After the volcanic eruptions ended, erosion began. Rain, wind, rivers, the annual freeze-thaw cycle of harsh Anatolian winters all worked to wear away the soft tuff. But in some places a cap of harder rock, basalt or andesite from later lava flows, protected the tuff beneath it. While the surrounding material eroded away, these protected columns remained standing. Over thousands of years, the landscape transformed into something surreal, a forest of stone pillars, each one a natural sculpture created by time and weather. Scientists have measured how fast this happens. Using cosmogenic nuclids, isotopes created when cosmic rays strike rock surfaces, geologists can calculate erosion rates with remarkable precision. In Cappadocia, the plateau surfaces erode at roughly 6 to 9 millimeters per 1,000 years. The fairy chimneys themselves, more exposed to wind and rain, erode perhaps a few centimeters per millennium. These are geological timescales, imperceptible to human life, but relentless over deep time. What this means is that the landscape humans encountered when they first arrived in Cappadocia was already ancient, already carved into shapes that looked designed rather than natural. The stone invited excavation. It practically announced itself as shelter material. You could carve a room in a few weeks, a complex in a season, a city over generations, and once carved, the spaces would last. But there's another property of tuff that matters even more than workability: thermal mass. The rock's thickness and porosity give it extraordinary insulation properties. Measurements taken inside Cappadocia's underground spaces show that internal temperatures hover between 55 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of the season above. In summer, when surface temperatures can reach well over 100 degrees, underground chambers remain cool and comfortable. In winter, when the plateau freezes, the deep tunnels stay mild. Humidity is similarly regulated. The porous tuff absorbs excess moisture and releases it gradually, preventing the damp, mold-prone conditions you'd expect in a cave. Combine this with careful engineering, the ventilation shafts and air channels carved throughout Derinkuyu, and you create an environment that's not just survivable underground, but genuinely comfortable. You could live there for months without ever feeling the claustrophobia or physical misery you'd expect from subterranean existence. The earth itself seemed designed to accommodate human refugees. That's the strange invitation Cappadocia extended. Other regions have caves, other places have soft stone, but few combine workability, structural stability, and environmental regulation the way Cappadocian tuff does. It's almost as if the landscape was waiting for people desperate enough to accept its offer. And desperate people came, wave after wave of them, across millennia, each generation finding the same solution carved a little deeper into the same obliging stone. The Hittites may be early in the story, though evidence is sparse. The Phrygians almost certainly, leaving behind architectural traces in the upper levels. The Persians passed through, the Greeks, the Romans. then the Byzantines, who would transform underground refuge from temporary shelter into a way of life. But they were all building on a foundation laid by geology. The volcanoes that erupted millions of years before the first human ever saw Cappadocia created the conditions that would define the region's history. They buried the future in ash. And from that ash, compressed by time into workable stone, humans would carve their refuge from a world that kept trying to destroy them. The paradox isn't just why people dug Derinkuyu. It's why the Earth made it so easy for them to do so, as if the planet itself understood that this crossroads of empires, this frontier where civilizations collided, would need a place to hide when the world above became unlivable. The stone was ready. All it needed was fear sufficient to drive people underground, and the determination to carve an entire city into darkness rather than face whatever was coming across the plateau. That fear was already on its way. Long before anyone thought to dig downward, the plateau itself had already chosen its role. Cappadocia sits in the heart of Anatolia, perched on high ground between mountain ranges and river valleys that funnel movement across the continent. To the south, the Taurus Mountains rise like a wall, separating the plateau from the Mediterranean coast and the plains of Syria. To the north, the land slopes toward the Black Sea through a maze of passes and highlands. East and west, the plateau stretches toward the Iranian frontier and the Aegean coast respectively, creating natural corridors that link three continents. This isn't an accident of perception. It's geography as destiny. If you wanted to move goods, armies, or ideas between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean, between the Iranian plateau and Europe, between the wealth of the East and the powers of the West, you crossed Anatolia. And Cappadocia sat right in the middle of that crossing, unavoidable, inescapable, perpetually in the path of everyone going anywhere. As early as the second millennium before the Common Era, long before Derinkuyu was even imagined, merchants from Assyria established colonies on the plateau. At Kültepe, near modern Kayseri, archaeologists have found thousands of cuneiform tablets, business records from trading posts that handled caravans moving tin, textiles and silver between Mesopotamia and Anatolia. These weren't temporary camps. They were permanent settlements with warehouses, residential quarters, and administrative buildings. The trade was lucrative enough, reliable enough, that merchants were willing to invest in infrastructure hundreds of miles from home. This marked Cappadocia as valuable, worth controlling, worth fighting over. And fight they did. The Hattians, whoever they were, native Anatolians whose language we barely understand, held the region first. Then came the Hittites, building their empire across Anatolia during the Late Bronze Age, incorporating Cappadocia into a state system that stretched from the Aegean to the Euphrates. For centuries the plateau was Hittite heartland, protected, administered, taxed, integrated into one of the great powers of the ancient world. Then the Hittites collapsed. Around 1200 years before the Common Era, the Bronze Age world system disintegrated in a cascade of destructions that historians still don't fully understand. Cities burned from Greece to Egypt, trade networks collapsed, empires vanished, and Cappadocia found itself suddenly on the frontier of a darker, more fragmented world. The Phrygians moved into Anatolia from the northwest, establishing kingdoms that would leave their mark on the plateau. Later, Lydian influence reached inland from the Aegean coast, but control was looser now, more contested, more violent. Then came the Persians. Around 550 BCE, the Achaemenid Empire swept across the Near East, absorbing kingdoms and peoples into the largest state the world had yet seen. Cappadocia became the satrapy of Katpatuka, a provincial designation that would echo through history in various forms, Persian, Greek, Roman, always recognizable, always referring to this same stretch of volcanic plateau, The Persians built roads, the famous royal road system that linked Susa and Persepolis to Sardis and the Aegean, with branches running through Cappadocia. Caravans moved along these routes under imperial protection, carrying tribute, trade goods, diplomatic correspondence, and armies when the empire required them. Being on the royal road meant prosperity. It also meant perpetual vulnerability. Every time the Persian king needed to move troops west to deal with Greek rebellions, those armies marched through Cappadocia. Every time a rebel satrap raised the standard of revolt, Cappadocia became a battleground or a supply base. You couldn't opt out of imperial politics when the empire's infrastructure ran through your fields. When Alexander the Great destroyed the Achaemenid Empire, Cappadocia briefly enjoyed independence under Hellenistic kings, local dynasties that emerged from the wreckage of Persian rule. For roughly 3 centuries, the kingdom of Cappadocia maintained a precarious autonomy, playing Rome against Pontus, Pontus against Armenia, surviving through diplomacy and tribute when survival through strength wasn't possible. But this independence was always conditional, always fragile. In 17 CE, Rome finally tired of client kings and incorporated Cappadocia directly as a province. The plateau was Roman now, administered from Caesarea, modern Kayseri, a city that would remain the region's dominant urban centre for the next 1,000 years. Roman rule brought infrastructure, roads, fortifications, markets. It also brought Rome's enemies. Every time Parthia and later Sasanian Persia launched campaigns against the eastern Roman provinces, Cappadocia sat on the invasion route. Armies from Ctesiphon marched west across the plateau. Roman legions marched east to meet them. The land between became a buffer zone, contested, raided, never quite safe even when officially at peace. Then Rome itself split, transformed, became Byzantium, and Cappadocia found itself on perhaps the most dangerous frontier of all, the border between Christian Byzantium and, after the 7th century, the expanding Islamic caliphates. Arab raids became annual events. The region between Caesarea and Melitene turned into a militarized no-man's land, a devastated corridor where Byzantine and Arab forces skirmished, burned, looted, and withdrew, only to return the next year and do it again. Villages were sacked so many times that survivors stopped rebuilding above ground. Why construct houses that would burn the next time raiders appeared? After the Arabs came the Seljuks, Turkish warriors who shattered Byzantine power at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 and claimed Anatolia for themselves. Their Mongol invasions from the east, waves of horse archers who destroyed armies and cities with methodical efficiency. Then Turkmen Beyliks, fragmented successor states fighting among themselves for control of Anatolia's trade and taxes. Finally, the Ottomans building yet another empire, the latest in a succession stretching back 3,000 years, all claiming the same strategic plateau. Each wave of conquerors brought the same dilemma for the people living on the land. You couldn't fight empires. You couldn't negotiate with raiders who appeared without warning, took what they wanted and vanished before organized resistance could form. You couldn't trust that this year's overlord would protect you from next year's invaders. The landscape was too open, too accessible, too valuable to be left alone. Armies would always come. Bandits would always raid. Tribute collectors would always demand their share. This was the price of living at the crossroads. So Cappadocians developed something that looked like paranoia to outsiders, but was actually pragmatic, multi-generational survival wisdom. You prepared for the worst. You built refuges. You stored supplies. You kept plans for evacuation, concealment, long-term survival without help from whatever empire currently claimed to rule you. This wasn't cowardice. It was realism. History had taught the same lesson over and over for 3 millennia. The powerful fight their wars across your land, and the survivors are the ones who know when to disappear. In a land where safety was always temporary and threats were always gathering beyond the horizon, Someone finally had an idea that would define the region forever. Not building higher walls, not raising bigger armies, not appealing to distant emperors who might or might not send help. Instead, going down into the soft, obliging tuff that had been waiting beneath their feet since the volcanoes fell silent. Down where armies couldn't follow, down where the stone itself would protect them, down into darkness, and somehow, improbably, into safety. So who actually started digging? That's the question everyone wants answered. When you stand at the entrance to Derinkuyu today, looking at the narrow passages descending into darkness, when you think about the sheer scale of the project, the countless tons of stone removed grain by grain over generations, you naturally want to know who first broke ground, who had the idea, who took the first swing with a bronze pick against volcanic tuff and thought, yes, this will work. We can live down here. The honest answer is that nobody knows, not with certainty. The deeper answer is that the question itself might be wrong, that asking for a single founder is like asking which raindrop started the river. Derinkuyu wasn't built, it grew, layer by layer, crisis by crisis, generation by generation, over so many centuries that the beginning blurs into legend, and the attribution becomes more about tradition than evidence. But let's examine what we actually know, and what scholars argue about when they argue about Derinkuyu's origins. The most commonly cited hypothesis points to the Phrygians. These were the people who moved into central Anatolia sometime around the 12th century BCE, after the Hittite Empire collapsed and the Bronze Age world disintegrated into chaos. The Phrygians built kingdoms, left behind tombs and inscriptions, and most importantly for our purposes, they carved extensively into rock. Phrygian facades still stand in the highlands, religious monuments cut directly into cliff faces with elaborate geometric patterns. They understood the tuff, they knew how to work it, and they lived in Cappadocia during the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, a period when many scholars place the earliest systematic excavation at Derinkuyu. The architectural parallels are suggestive. Phrygian rock-cut structures elsewhere in Anatolia show design principles, corridor layouts, ventilation strategies that echo what we see in Derinkuyu's upper levels. If you are going to bet on a founder culture based purely on circumstantial evidence, stylistic comparison and regional presence during the right time period, the Phrygians would be the safest bet. That's why so many reference works confidently state that Derinkuyu was built by Phrygians in the 8th century BCE. It fits, it makes sense, it's probably even partly true, but probably isn't the same as certainly. And other scholars push the origins deeper into the past. Some argue that the very earliest chambers, simple storage spaces or small shelters carved into accessible tuff outcrops could date back to the Hittite period itself. Late Bronze Age communities during the 14th or 13th centuries BCE, facing the same problems of invasion, instability and resource protection that would plague the region for the next 3 millennia. Maybe they dug the first holes. Maybe what the Phrygians did was expand and systematize something that already existed in rudimentary form, transforming scattered refuges into a connected network. The evidence for this Hittite origin theory is thin. There's no securely dated Hittite material from Derinkuyu's oldest excavated areas. No pottery shards that can be definitively placed before 1200 BCE. No inscriptions in Hittite cuneiform carved into the walls. Just the logical argument that someone must have been using Cappadocia's soft stone for shelter during the chaotic collapse period, and if they were, those early efforts might be the forgotten foundation beneath everything else. Then there's the Persian-era hypothesis, which rests on one of the few ancient texts that might actually describe underground settlements in Cappadocia. Around 401 BCE, the Greek soldier and historian Xenophon passed through parts of Anatolia with the 10,000, that famous mercenary army trying to fight its way home after their employer's death in Mesopotamia. In his account of the journey, the Anabasis, Xenophon describes villages where the inhabitants had excavated their houses underground, with entrances like wells, but spacious below. He notes that these underground homes had rooms for people, livestock, and stored provisions, enough space for entire families to live comfortably beneath the surface. Local tradition connects this passage to Cappadocia's underground cities, and some researchers argue that at least the first two levels of Derinkuyu might date to this general period, the 5th or 4th centuries BCE. The timing works. The Achaemenid Persian Empire controlled the region then, and the plateau had seen enough warfare, enough instability, enough reason for communities to seek permanent refuge underground. Maybe what Xenophon saw was Derinkuyu in an early phase, already substantial enough to house families and animals, but not yet the vast labyrinth it would become. What's most likely is that all these theories are partially correct. Derinkuyu wasn't a single construction project. It was a multi-phase development spanning at least a millennium, possibly much longer. Maybe Hittite-era farmers dug the first storage chambers and seasonal shelters. Maybe Phrygians expanded those early excavations into the first true refuge levels during the 8th or 7th centuries. Maybe Persian-era communities added more rooms, deeper shafts, better ventilation systems, when Arab raids or Persian-Byzantine wars made permanent underground infrastructure necessary. And we know for certain that Byzantine Christians dramatically enlarged the complex between the 7th and 11th centuries CE, adding chapels, schools, communal spaces, and the sophisticated defensive features that make Derinkuyu so remarkable today. Each generation inherited the work of their predecessors and added what they needed for their own survival. This city grew like a tree grows, ring by ring, each layer recording different threats, different solutions, different communities facing the same fundamental problem: how to stay alive when the world above ground kept trying to kill them. This is why dating Derinkuyu is so maddeningly difficult. When you're working with structures carved directly into stone, you don't have the usual archaeological tools. There are no tree rings to count, no mortar to carbon date, no stratified deposits of pottery that got buried when one phase ended and another began, just stone and tool marks in stone, and the occasional artifact left behind when inhabitants fled or died. You can date those artifacts, but that only tells you when someone was using a particular chamber, not when it was first excavated. So the origins remain genuinely mysterious. Not mysterious in the conspiracy theory sense, where someone knows but won't tell us. Mysterious in the deeper, more humbling sense that the evidence doesn't exist anymore, if it ever did. The people who took the first swings at the tuff left no written records. Their tools dissolved into rust centuries ago. The stone they removed was piled outside and weathered away, or was quarried for other purposes. What remains is the negative space, the absence they carved. An absence doesn't speak clearly about its own creation. But perhaps that ambiguity is fitting. Derinkuyu's origins are buried in the same darkness as the city itself, hidden beneath layers of time and stone and accumulated history. We know someone began the work, probably during an age of bronze weapons and collapsing empires. We know others continued it, expanded it, transformed it over centuries. We know it kept saving lives, kept serving its purpose, kept pulling people underground whenever the surface world became unlivable, and maybe that's the only origin story that really matters, not which king commissioned it or which empire funded the excavation, but the simple, desperate, ingenious decision that someone, somewhere, sometime deep in the past made to stop running and start digging instead. Now it's time to actually go down. Imagine you're standing at the entrance. Not the modern tourist access with its handrails and electric lighting, but the original opening. A shaft, maybe a meter wide, dropping vertically into darkness. The stone around the lip is smooth from countless hands gripping it over centuries, worn by ropes hauling supplies up and bodies climbing down. The air that rises from below smells different, cooler, damper. It carries a faint mineral tang, the breath of stone that hasn't seen sunlight in millennia. You descend. The first few meters are the hardest psychologically. Natural light fades fast. The walls press close. If you're carrying a torch, the flame flickers and dims as the oxygen thins slightly, then steadies as you reach the first ventilation shaft. Your eyes adjust. The passage levels out, broadens just enough to let you straighten your back, and you find yourself in the outermost ring of Derinkuyu's defences. The first level is pragmatic, functional. This is where the animals lived. Stables carved directly into the tuff, low-ceilinged chambers with feeding troughs hollowed out of the floor, and drainage channels that slope gently downward to carry waste away to collection sumps. The stone here is rougher than in deeper levels, less finished. Tool marks from bronze and iron picks score the walls in parallel lines. You can still see them after 2,000 years, the rhythm of someone's work preserved in stone. Why keep animals on the first level? Because they are expendable. If attackers breach the entrance, better they encounter livestock than people. The animals serve as an early warning system. They're panic-alerting defenders below. They also provide a psychological barrier. Invaders might stop to slaughter or steal the cattle, giving residents time to seal the deeper passages. And if a siege drags on for weeks, having animals close to the surface means less effort hauling fodder down from storage levels far below. Everything about Derinkuyu's design is intentional, every choice made with survival in mind. You move deeper. The corridor narrows deliberately. You have to turn sideways in places, and if you're carrying anything bulky, a sack of grain, a water jar, you have to pass it ahead of you or drag it behind. This isn't an oversight in the design. This is the design. These choke points can be defended by a single person. One individual with a spear can hold a passage like this against a dozen attackers. The narrowness forces enemies into single file, negates their numerical advantage, turns every corridor into a potential killing ground. Between the first and second levels, you encounter the rolling stones, great circular slabs of rock, some weighing close to 500 kilograms, fitted into grooves carved into the passage walls. When not in use, they rest in recessed alcoves. When needed, one person pushing from below can roll them into place, sealing the passage completely. There's no handle on the outside, no grip, no way to move them from above except by smashing through a meter of solid stone. The residents below can lock themselves in and wait. Wait for the enemy to exhaust themselves. Wait for supplies to run out. Wait for reinforcements. Wait for winter. Wait for politics to shift. Wait for whatever threat drove them underground to pass. The second level feels more lived in. The chambers here are larger, the ceilings higher, though still low enough that you have to mind your head in the passages. Living quarters line the main corridors, small rooms, family-sized, each carved with niches in the walls for oil lamps, shelves for possessions, sleeping platforms raised slightly off the floor. The stone is warmer here, holding residual heat from the bodies that once filled these spaces. In winter, when snow piled meters deep on the surface, the temperature down here stayed constant. Around 13 degrees Celsius year-round, cold enough to need blankets, warm enough that you wouldn't freeze. Kitchens occupy central positions on this level, communal spaces where multiple families shared hearths carved into the rock. The ceilings above these hearths are blackened by centuries of smoke, stained so thoroughly that the soot has become part of the stone itself. But look closer and you'll see the ventilation holes, narrow shafts angling upward through the rock, dispersing smoke so efficiently that inhabitants could cook underground without suffocating. The shafts emerge on the surface disguised as natural fissures in the hillside, nearly invisible unless you know exactly where to look. Storage rooms radiate out from the kitchens. Large chambers filled with clay vessels, pithoi as tall as a person, used for storing grain, olive oil, wine, dried fruits, preserved meat. Some of these jars are still in place, empty now, but still sealed to their stone niches with centuries-old plaster. The scale of storage suggests long-term occupation, not days or weeks underground, but months, maybe longer. This is infrastructure for outlasting winter, outlasting war, outlasting whatever fresh catastrophe the surface world could produce. The third level brings specialized functions. Here you find the wineries, chambers with great presses carved directly into the floor, collection basins where juice would flow into fermentation vessels. The presses are sophisticated, showing deep understanding of leverage and fluid dynamics. Communities underground weren't just surviving, they were maintaining their culture, their traditions, their taste for wine even in the depths of the earth. You also find what's generally identified as a religious school on this level, or sometimes the second, depending on how you count the irregular subdivisions. A barrel-vaulted hall, longer than most other chambers, with small side rooms branching off like cells in a monastery. These rooms are barely large enough for one person to sit and read by lamplight, study spaces for missionaries or monks learning scripture in the dark. The presence of a school this deep suggests that whatever drove people underground lasted long enough that they had to educate their children here, pass on knowledge, maintain continuity even when cut off completely from the world above. Descending further, around the transition between the third and fourth levels, you reach the cruciform church, a cross-shaped chapel carved with precision that contrasts sharply with the rougher utilitarian spaces above. The walls here are smoother, the proportions more carefully considered, niches for icons, a small apse oriented, as best as can be determined this far underground, toward the east, toward Jerusalem, toward the rising sun that people down here might not see for months. This is where faith lived in the darkness, where communities gathered to pray, to sing, to remind themselves they were still human, still worthy of salvation, still connected to something larger than stone and fear. Below the church, the functions become harder to identify. The 5th, 6th, 7th levels where surveys have been conducted contain more storage, more living spaces, but also chambers whose purposes scholars still debate. Some rooms are too small for habitation, too large for storage. Meeting rooms, perhaps, armories, prisons, or simply spaces dug out and never finished, abandoned when the crisis passed and inhabitants could return to the surface. And beneath those levels, if the local estimates are accurate, lie as many as 10 more. Passages that haven't been fully explored. Chambers still filled with rubble. Shafts that descend beyond the reach of modern lighting. The official tourist route stops around 50 meters down, roughly 8 accessible levels. But the stories, the surveys, the measurements taken by engineers who've rappelled deeper suggest that Derinkuyu extends perhaps 85 meters into the earth. 18 levels total, maybe more, threading through everything. Binding all these levels together into a functioning city is the ventilation system. Over 50 major shafts have been mapped, with estimates of more than 15,000 smaller ducts branching and interconnecting like a stone nervous system. The main shaft is the masterpiece, 55 meters deep, carved with extraordinary precision from the surface straight down to the lowest inhabited levels. It functioned as both well and air chimney. Water collected at the bottom, drawn up in buckets to supply every level. Air circulated naturally through temperature differentials, warm exhalations rising, cool surface air descending, creating a slow, constant flow that kept thousands of people alive in what should have been a suffocating tomb. The engineering is so sophisticated that it verges on the uncanny. How did Bronze Age or Iron Age communities, working by lamplight with primitive tools, calculate airflow dynamics? How did they ensure ventilation shafts carved from different levels would actually meet in the middle of solid rock? How did they prevent the main well shaft from flooding the lower levels during spring thaws? We don't know. The techniques died with their creators. What remains is the result, this impossible city beneath the earth, still breathing after millennia, still ready to shelter anyone desperate enough to descend into its ancient dark. If Derinkuyu were only an engineering marvel, it would be impressive enough. But at some point all of this stops being architecture and becomes something else. It becomes a Tuesday, because as soon as the rolling stone slid into place and the last shaft cover was lowered on the surface, this maze of tunnels turned into home, not in an abstract poetic way, in the literal sense of where you cook, where you sleep, where your children learn to read, where your neighbour's baby cries at 3 a.m, and there is nowhere else for the sound to go. Picture one of those long underground stays, the kind that lasted not hours but weeks. Maybe raiders have been sighted on the plateau. Maybe a warband is moving through the valley. Maybe there are rumours of a tax collector with soldiers at his back. Whatever the trigger, word passes quickly along footpaths and churchyards and market stalls. We're going down. By the time the last families reach the entrance, the first fires have already been lit in the communal kitchens. The kitchens are the heartbeat of underground life. You can imagine the routine settling in almost immediately. At dawn, or what passes for dawn when the only clock you have is habit, someone stirs embers in a soot-blackened hearth, adds dried brush and a pinch of animal fat, coaxes flame to life. The ceiling above is as dark as a night sky, layers of smoke baked into the tuff until the rock itself has turned the colour of charcoal. But the room doesn't choke. The builders angled narrow shafts up and away, invisible flues that sip the smoke and exhale it into the open air, far above unsuspecting travellers. Around those fires, meals are an exercise in planning and restraint. You're not cooking today's catch from the river, or cutting fresh vegetables from a garden. You're measuring out scoops of grain from storage jars as tall as your chest. You're checking the level of oil, counting the sacks of dried figs, the amphorae of wine pressed in quieter months. Scholars think Derinkuyu could shelter thousands of people. Some estimates reach as high as 20,000 plus their animals. Feeding a crowd like that underground is less like a family dinner and more like running a mobile logistics operation. So there is structure. There has to be. Someone decides which jars can be opened and which must wait. Someone knows how much wheat to grind each day, how many lamps can burn through the night without wasting oil. In modern terms, we might call them quartermasters, or elders, or simply the people everyone else knows better than to argue with when the doors are locked. While food, oil and wine come from sealed stone rooms, water is different. Water is alive, moving. The great central shaft that once felt like an abstract engineering feat now becomes a lifeline. Buckets rise and fall continuously, hauled by hand or with simple pulleys, drawing cool, mineral-rich water from tens of meters below. Stories say that if enemies ever took control of the surface, the opening at the top of the shaft could be blocked, or at least monitored, so that poison or debris dropped in would never reach the lowest, most protected layers. Whether every detail of that tradition is accurate or not, the intent is clear. Water was to remain theirs, even when the world above belonged to someone else, and then there is everything the water cannot wash away. Waste. Archaeology is discreet about it, but no city, above or below, escapes the problem. Hundreds or thousands of bodies eating, sweating, coughing, living in close quarters inevitably produce refuse. Down here, with no rainstorms to flush the streets and no scavenging dogs to pick bones clean, the stakes are higher. We don't have a detailed instruction manual carved into the walls about how they handle sanitation, but we can infer pieces. The floors in animal stables slope very slightly, just enough to guide liquids into narrow channels and sumps. Some side chambers, awkwardly placed for sleeping or storage, may have been designated waste rooms, places where jars or pits collected what no one wanted near the kitchens or the church. Everything we know about pre-modern siege life tells us there would have been rules. Where to relieve yourself, when refuse can be carried toward the upper levels, who is responsible for keeping pathways clear. Here, the same ventilation system that feeds the hearths and cools the corridors becomes a quiet ally. Airless caves breed disease. Derinkuyu breathes. External measurements in similar Cappadocian sites show that temperature and humidity underground stay almost constant. A cool, damp gentleness that doesn't favour the extremes many pathogens love. Fresh air, pulled in through dozens of shafts and drawn through the levels by subtle pressure differences, would have helped dilute smells and reduce some of the worst health risks of confinement. But airflow doesn't solve everything. Illness still moves faster when people sleep shoulder to shoulder. Coughs echo through stone. For all its insulation, Derinkuyu couldn't insulate its residents completely from the biological cost of proximity. Somewhere in these levels, there were people whose job, or whose fate, was to tend the sick, to separate the clearly contagious from the merely unlucky, to decide when a fever meant a person could no longer share a crowded sleeping alcove. All of this plays out against a constant sensory background that slowly reshapes the mind. The absence of sunlight, for one. Up on the Anatolian plateau, the sun can be vicious, blazing in summer, glaring off winter snow. Down here, it is theoretical. Days and nights become measured by relit lamps, by meal times, by the muffled rumour of footsteps and the brief commotion when someone returns from a higher level with news from the door. Children born on the surface would have remembered the world of wind and colour. Children young enough might start to forget. In one of the barrel-vaulted halls, possibly a religious school, possibly a general teaching space, you can imagine lessons continuing even as danger prowls outside. Boys chanting scripture, or repeating letters, or simply being kept busy so parents can haul water and grind flour. Girls learning prayers, or songs, or domestic tasks adapted to the underground. How to trim a wick, how to stretch an oil jar through another week. In the cruciform church below, services would continue, perhaps more frequent and more urgent when fear was highest. Candles and oil lamps throw shifting gold on carved walls. Priests' voices carry oddly in the cramped geometry of the chapel, words catching at corners and returning as soft echoes. For people who might not see the sky for a month, faith isn't an abstract system of beliefs. It is a structured way of passing time, of binding neighbours together, of explaining why enduring this confinement matters. Psychologically, Derinkuyu is both shelter and pressure cooker. The stone keeps you safe from arrows and fire and sudden raids. It also means you cannot walk away from an argument. Your irritable uncle, the neighbour whose baby never sleeps, the man who always tries to take more than his ration. There is no horizon you can retreat to, no field you can cross to be alone. Privacy shrinks to the thickness of a wall, which in some places is measured in centimetres. Above all this human drama, on the upper levels the animals continue their own constrained existence. Cattle, sheep, goats, maybe poultry. They are fed from the same stores you rely on. Their bodies add heat to the first chambers. Their breath thickens the air. The planners of Derinkuyu place them here intentionally. Close enough to protect, close enough to slaughter if the siege stretches longer than anyone hoped, but high enough that their noise and smell can vent upwards, toward the open exits rather than sinking into the deeper living quarters. If you stand mentally at the midpoint of the city, between the stables and the chapels, between the well and the outer doors, you can feel the invisible architecture of social order. Lines of responsibility run through these tunnels as clearly as the air shafts do. Someone assigns which families get which alcoves. Someone decides when the animals are butchered and how the meat is distributed. Someone keeps track of whose sons are standing watch in which corridor, whose daughters are assisting in the kitchens, who's allowed where and when. We don't know what titles those people carried. Elders, priests, local notables. Perhaps there was a council that only truly came into its own when the stone doors rolled shut. What we can say is that an underground city is never just a physical refuge. It is a political machine, a social contract written not on parchment, but in daily routines. Light the lamps at an agreed hour, share the water, keep the waste moving upward and the news flowing downward. Pray together, eat in turn, endure. Outside, empires rise and fall, wars start and end, flags change on distant citadels. Inside, life in the dark settles into its own deep rhythm, as steady and contained as the cool air in the tunnels, and yet Derinkuyu was never meant to be permanent exile. These people did not carve 18 floors into the earth because they wanted to forget the sky. They wanted to survive long enough to see it again, which is why, eventually, the same hands that once sealed the rolling stones would push them back, just a little, to listen for silence on the other side. Sometimes, when the listening stops, the quiet that comes back isn't peace, it's hooves. Imagine you're in Cappadocia in the 7th century. On the map you belong to the Byzantine Empire, heirs of Rome, guardians of Christian orthodoxy, all those grand titles. In reality, you live in a stone house on a windswept plateau, and the empire is a rumour that travels with tax collectors and soldiers who appear and then vanish every few years. What does not vanish are the raids. Across the mountains to the southeast, a new power has risen. The early Islamic caliphates push north and west, and the frontier between worlds runs somewhere through these volcanic hills. It is not a neat frontier. It slides back and forth with every campaign, every treaty, every rumour of weakness in Constantinople. Out here, you don't see most of that. What you see are the summer raids, Arab cavalry moving fast. They are not here to build cities or hold ground. They are here for what frontier war rewards: plunder, captives, grain, animals, anything that can ride back with them when the season turns. They know the empire is slow to respond, that its armies are tied up defending passes and fortresses far away. They ride in, they hit hard, and they leave before anyone organised can catch them. If you are a strategist sitting in a palace, this is a problem of logistics and defence lines. If you are a farmer in Cappadocia, it is a problem of minutes. How fast can you disappear? Above ground, most defences are visible, and what is visible can be burned or taken. A stone church can be looted, a hilltop watchtower can be stormed, even a walled town, unless it is very strong, can be surrounded, its gates tested, its fields torched. But Derinkuyu, and dozens of places like it, offer a different answer. They don't try to look strong. They try not to look like anything at all. By the time the hooves are close, the lesson from generations of raids is clear. You do not stand in the doorway with a spear and hope. You carry what you can and you go down. The same tunnels that your grandparents used to wait out bandits and tax levies are deepened, widened, refined in this era of holy wars on the frontier. The Byzantine period, especially from about the 7th to the 11th centuries, is when Derinkuyu seems to swell to something like its full, astounding size. Earlier passages are cleaned and straightened. New levels are driven further into the tuff. Storage rooms expand, corridors multiply. Rolling stone doors are added or improved. Everything is tuned to one strategic reality. Raids are fast. Survival depends on being slower. Not slower in running, slower in being found, slower in being worth the effort. Think about incentives from the raider's point of view. You've ridden days to get here. Your horses need pasture. Your men expect loot. You see a valley with several small settlements. One has smoke from its chimneys, carts in the road, animals in the fields. The other looks oddly still. A few low stone structures, no movement, maybe a closed church, maybe a well. If you pound on the doors and no one answers, how long do you spend investigating? Hours? A day? 2? Every day you linger is another day for Byzantine scouts to spot your column and warn a garrison. There are easier villages just over the ridge, with granaries you can break open and people who haven't carved themselves into the earth. This is the quiet calculation that underlies Derinkuyu's expansion. A surface that looks poor and empty, an underworld that is anything but. The Byzantines, for all their theological disputes and palace intrigues, were practical about this. Cappadocia becomes not just a frontier, but a reservoir of hidden Christians, communities that can vanish below the surface when the dust of distant armies appears. Derinkuyu turns from a refuge of last resort into a deliberately maintained system. You keep stores topped up because you know you'll need them. You repair tunnels and doors not for some hypothetical future war, but for the summer after next. And as more people rely on the underground city, it changes. It becomes more visibly Christian. Walk in your mind down from the stables and the kitchens, deeper into the Byzantine levels. The rougher, older rooms, maybe Phrygian, maybe Roman in their origin, give way to spaces shaped by a different set of priorities. Faith, as much as fear, carves these chambers. You find a church cut in the shape of a cross, not a grand basilica with domes and mosaics, but a modest cruciform chapel, arms and nave hewn straight from the rock. At the eastern end, a small apse is carved, a half-dome in miniature where an altar once stood. The walls may have been plastered and painted once, faint traces of pigment clinging where moisture and time have not erased them entirely. Simple crosses scratched or incised into the tuff turn the bare stone into a proclamation. This is a Christian space, even if no one on the surface can see it. Nearby there's a basin sunk into the floor. Some call it a baptismal font. Others suggest it was a cistern repurposed for ritual. Either way, water and rebirth, in the literal and theological sense, meet underground. To bring new members into the faith not just inside a cave, but inside an entire hidden world is a statement. We expect to be hunted, and yet we intend to endure. Farther along the level, there's that long barrel-vaulted room often interpreted as a religious school. In the Byzantine expansion, this makes perfect sense. This is an era when disputes over doctrine can unsettle an entire province, when councils and creeds matter, when literacy among clergy is crucial. Teaching scripture, copying texts, training young clerics, or simply catechizing children, all of this could happen here, even when raiders patrol the valley above. The empire's intellectual and spiritual life retreating into the earth, waiting for the danger to pass. And not far from worship and instruction, you encounter the dead. In the soft rock near some chapels, neat niches are cut, just large enough for a body. Sometimes there are small chambers that appear to have been family tombs, where bones could be gathered after first burial and arranged with care. If Derinkuyu was a city for the living in crisis, parts of it were also a quiet repository of ancestors, an underground cemetery bound to the rhythms of liturgy echoing in the next room. In this Byzantine phase, the city doesn't just protect bodies, it shelters a whole cosmology, prayers, sacraments, doctrine, memory and bones, all layered into the stone. And Derinkuyu is not alone. Across the same band of tuff stretching between Nevşehir and Kayseri, hundreds of other settlements pockmark the landscape. More than 200 underground sites are known today, ranging from modest two-level refuges to sprawling complexes with 3, 4 or more descending stories. At least 40 of them reach depths and complexities that qualify as small siblings of Derinkuyu. Kaymaklu, Uskonak, Mazi, and many more. Each one a potential bolt hole when hooves or dust on the horizon send the same message: go down. It's tempting to picture all of these cities connected by a single, continuous web of tunnels, a true subterranean network where you could walk from village to village without ever seeing the sun. Local stories certainly lean in that direction. Ask a guide in Cappadocia, and they might tell you that Derinkuyu is linked to Kaymaklu by a tunnel around 9 kilometers long. Some short intersight passages have indeed been found, little arteries where two nearby complexes almost touch. It's plausible that, in some cases, communities deliberately dug toward each other to share resources or create escape routes. But when archaeologists look for a solid, uninterrupted Derinkuyu to Kaymakla highway under the fields, the evidence becomes less clear. Parts of the route are unexplored. Surveys hint at passages, but a fully mapped tunnel running the entire distance has not yet appeared in the academic reports. For now, that great corridor lies somewhere between folklore and possibility. Even without a single continuous tunnel, though, the pattern is unmistakable. Derinkuyu sits not as an isolated marvel, but as the largest known node in a dense network of survival strategies. A region-wide habit of thinking vertically when danger came horizontally. On the surface, Cappadocia in the Byzantine era might have looked like any other rough frontier. Scattered farms, monasteries chipped into rock faces, small churches with fading frescoes, imperial authority that waxed and waned with the fortunes of distant emperors. But beneath those ordinary villages lay the real insurance policy. Whole landscapes were double-layered, one world for peacetime, another for trouble. And for 4 centuries or so, as Arab-Byzantine conflicts flared and cooled and flared again, that hidden world was not just emergency shelter. It was part of how these communities understood themselves. They were Christians of the borderlands, people for whom the words "this world is not our home" had a literal architectural echo. When the call to prayer sounded from a distant raiding camp, or when news reached them of another fortress fallen, they could answer with a different liturgy, whispered under vaulted ceilings of stone, secure in the knowledge that empires might clash above. But down here, among crosses carved into rock and lessons murmured by lamplight, the community could contract, endure, and then someday rise again into the light. The raids would change, the flags would change. New conquerors would discover that there were suddenly no people to collect, no easy spoils to seize, and still the doors would roll shut, and the same cool air would flow through the same shafts, and the habit of vanishing underground would pass from one generation to the next, until, centuries later, a different kind of horseman appeared on the horizon, and Derinkuyu's stones had to remember how to close themselves yet again. If you strip away the chapels and the schools and the storerooms, what remains of Derinkuyu is a machine designed to turn an invading army into a line of tired men staring at a round rock. Those round rocks are where the engineering genius of the place really shows. The rolling stone doors are so simple that it's easy to miss how clever they are. Start with the material. The tunnels and rooms of Derinkuyu are carved out of volcanic tuff, a relatively soft rock. That softness is what allows people with hand tools to dig 8, 10, maybe more levels deep over centuries. But a door that's soft would chip, crumble, give way. So the builders seem to have gone looking for something harder. Most accounts describe the big doors as carved not from the local tuff, but from denser, tougher stone, often compared to basalt or similar hard rock scattered through Cappadocia in old lava flows. Whether every single stone has been petrographically tested or not, the pattern fits the logic. Walls of soft stone for easy carving, doors of hard stone for staying power. Imagine the work involved. You find a suitable boulder. You rough it into a disc, something like a giant millstone. Many of the surviving examples are around 1 meter to 1.5 meters across, and perhaps 15 or 20 centimeters thick. They might weigh 3, 4, even 500 kilos, a half-ton of stubborn geology that no raiding party is going to shoulder aside. Then you don't just plop this disc in a doorway, you design the doorway around it. At key junctions, the tunnel widens on one side into a shallow niche, like a pocket in the wall. The floor and ceiling are cut with slight grooves. The stone door lives in that pocket, resting there, out of direct sight until it's needed. When danger comes, a few people on the safe side can lever it out of its recess and roll it along the grooves into place. The weight that makes it impossible for attackers to move from outside makes it satisfyingly final when it thuds into the carved stop. From the attacker's point of view, there is no handle, no hinge, no keyhole, just a seamless circle of rock pressed tight into the tuff around it. And in the middle of that circle, usually a hole. That central hole has generated all kinds of speculation. It might have been a peephole or a speaking hole, a way to look and listen without opening the door. It might also have been practical, a socket for a wooden bar or metal lever, used by defenders to help shift the stone from its recess. If someone on the far side tries to jab a spear through, they're presenting the tip of their weapon into a tiny, predictable target. A defender can meet wood or iron with another lever, snap it, or simply wait. The key detail is behavioral, not just physical. These doors are designed to be locked from one side only. From the inside you have leverage points, cutouts, little handholds. From the outside you have none. Your numerical advantage, dozens of raiders, maybe hundreds, means nothing if only one person at a time can press against a circular wall. Which brings us to the corridors. Derinkuyu's builders understood something that later castle architects would rediscover. You don't just block an enemy, you funnel them. Passages leading toward the deeper levels are often deliberately narrow, sometimes low enough that a tall man has to stoop. They bend at odd angles. They turn just before a doorway or a downward stair. An armed group moving through them is forced into single file, or at best a cramped double line, shields awkward, weapons catching on the walls. If you have to walk bent over, your balance is bad. Your field of view is bad. You can't swing a sword freely. You can't bring 10 men to bear at the same time on one defender. You can't even see what's around the next blind corner. But the people who live here can. They know every bend, every dip in the floor. They know which turns bring you face to face with a stone door, and which ones pass under small ceiling vents or side slits where a defender can thrust downward or drop stones, boiling water, burning oil, whatever the technology and the period allow. The whole thing becomes a series of engineered choke points. Each corridor is a little equation. How many men can pass in 30 seconds? How fast can they swing? How many can stand shoulder to shoulder? The answers are all the same. Not many, not fast, not enough. And if one choke point fails, you fall back to the next. Derinkuyu isn't a single door. It's a system of doors. The city is laced with these circular stones at major nodes, where levels change, where main galleries narrow, where side tunnels branch. Each level can be isolated from the next. If the upper stables are breached, you roll a stone and retreat. If a raiding party does manage to force its way past the first or second barrier, perhaps through betrayal, perhaps through sheer time and persistence, the inhabitants can withdraw deeper still, sealing each level behind them like a ship closing watertight bulkheads. This is defense in depth, centuries before that phrase was coined. A modular city that can shrink itself under pressure. In quiet years, you live in the upper stories, close to the surface, stables and workshops within easy reach of the fields. When trouble comes, you shed those layers like a snakeskin and become a smaller, tighter organism, pulsing in the safe core. Of course, none of this works without air. The real lifeline of Derinkuyu is invisible unless you look for it. A forest of shafts rising through the rock to the surface. Estimates vary, but accounts commonly speak of dozens of major ventilation channels, plus many smaller ones. One central shaft, around 55 meters deep, doubles as a well, giving the underground city its own water supply independent of what's happening on the fields above. But every opening is also a risk. If enemies suspect that people are hiding below, they don't need to batter down stone doors. They can pour smoke into a shaft or poison, or simply dump refuse and carcasses to foul the air and water. The builders of Derinkuyu seem to have anticipated this. Some shafts do not open as obvious wells in the middle of town. They emerge discreetly in courtyards, in houses, in places where a casual raider might not notice them at all. Others appear to have been accessible only from within the city, not from the surface, at least in certain periods, a way to guarantee that no one could walk up and toss something deadly down the hole. There is also evidence in both Derinkuyu and its neighbouring cities that some shafts could be choked or sealed from below, blocking airflow from a compromised opening while leaving other, safer channels active. It's a cruel choice, less air for more security, but it matches the entire philosophy of the place. You're always trading comfort for survivability, convenience for control. Seen with modern eyes, this all feels eerily familiar. Medieval castles built centuries after Derinkuyu's earliest phases follow similar principles. Concentric rings of walls, gatehouses that force attackers into narrow passageways under arrow slits, courtyards designed as kill zones, internal wells protected by the deepest keep. Derinkuyu is working from the same playbook, but it flips the drawing upside down. Where a castle reaches up, Derinkuyu reaches down. Where a fortress bristles with towers and crenellations, Derinkuyu offers almost nothing to see. The outer wall is not a ring of masonry. It is the earth itself. 10, 20, 30 meters of rock and soil above your head do the work that stone battlements would do on a hill. The controlled gate of a castle becomes a controlled stair in Derinkuyu, an entrance hidden under a house floor or disguised as a cellar or tucked into the wall of a courtyard. The bailey becomes the upper levels, stables, stores, spaces you can afford to lose. The keep is not the tallest tower, but the lowest habitable chamber, wrapped in layers of rock instead of layers of stone. You could stand on the plateau above Derinkuyu at the height of its use and see almost nothing that told you what lay beneath your feet. No grand curtain walls, no moats, no banners, just a landscape that looks poor and quiet and not worth dying over. That was the point. We tend to think of engineering brilliance as something that shows off. Cathedrals reaching into the sky, aqueducts striding across valleys, walls marching over mountains. Derinkuyu hides its genius. Its greatest achievements are cramped corridors and invisible shafts, doors that disappear into the dark, systems that are most successful when they convince an enemy to give up and ride away. In a world where power is usually expressed by building higher and brighter, the people of Cappadocia perfected the opposite art, building down and vanishing. For a long stretch of the Middle Ages, that art of vanishing seemed to work. Arab-Byzantine wars came and went. Frontier lines shifted. Emperors rose, lost battles, signed treaties. On the surface, Cappadocia changed hands more than once. Below, Derinkuyu and its neighbours waited in the dark, used when needed, then left to the silence. Then a new kind of storm rolled in. In the 13th century, rumours would have reached Cappadocia long before the riders did. Stories carried by traders, refugees, soldiers out of contract. Tales of steppe armies that moved faster than news, of towns burned because they lay between one empire and the next. We call them the Mongols. For people living in central Anatolia, they were simply another wave of disaster. Different language, different banners, same problem. Imagine you're a Christian farmer in a Cappadocian village. The Byzantines are a memory. The Seljuks rule the plateau. Somewhere far away in Konya or Kayseri, A sultan is trying to decide whether to fight or negotiate with the men from the east. None of that is in your control. What is in your control is this: the key to a low doorway in the back of your yard, steps cut into the rock, a smell of cool, dry air, a place your grandparents told you about, and their grandparents told them about, and so on, back through generations. By the time Mongol and later Timurid forces pushed across Anatolia in the 13th and 14th centuries, these underground complexes were not archaeological curiosities. They were infrastructure. In Greek, they were kataphigia, places of refuge. You didn't need an imperial edict to know what to do when strange banners appeared on the horizon. You went below. The threat landscape had changed. The Arab raiders of earlier centuries had come seeking slaves, plunder, strategic passes. The steppe armies were operating on an imperial scale, punishing resistance, devastating rebellious regions to make examples of them. But the logic of survival remained the same. On horseback, in open terrain, a Mongol army was almost unbeatable. In a tunnel a metre wide facing a stone disc, their speed and tactics meant nothing. There are no chronicles that give us a day-by-day account of Derinkuyu during these invasions. What we have are patterns, local traditions that speak of Tartar raids and people hiding in the earth. Archaeologists find continued use in Byzantine and post-Byzantine levels, soot on ceilings, smoke-blackened ventilation shafts, small modifications that look like later hands reworking older spaces. Layer by layer, the city records a simple message: we did this again. When the Seljuk realm fractured and the Ottoman state began to grow in its place, the surface story changed once more. New timbers on the houses, new taxes, different uniforms on the men who came to collect them. But under Ottoman rule, especially in the early centuries when authority was patchy and local power brokers mattered more than distant sultans, life in Cappadocia could still turn dangerous very quickly. Bandits operated along the trade routes. Feuds between villages could escalate. Periods of intercommunal tension flared into violence. Christians, Greeks and Armenians in particular, were legally tolerated as people of the book, but occupied a second-class status. For them, the old cities in the rock were a kind of insurance policy written in stone. You can picture the rhythm. Most years, the underground city is a storage space. Cool chambers hold grain, wine, dried fruits, tools. Maybe a few animals are stabled in the upper galleries when the weather turns bad. Children know not to play too far down. Older people remember which doors stick and which steps are cracked. The place is part of the village, but in the way a locked attic is part of a house. Present, but not central. Then something happens. Perhaps word comes of trouble in a neighbouring town. Perhaps someone has been killed on the road. Perhaps a tax dispute has gone wrong, or a local notable decides to settle scores under cover of a wider crisis. People begin to move, not in a panicked rush, not if they can help it. Quietly. Bedding, cooking pots, icons from the church, a few animals. The heaviest items are already down there. The architecture remembers its purpose. The upper chambers, designed centuries earlier as stables and workshops during sieges, become stables and workshops again. The chapels carved during Byzantine expansions host new liturgies, now in the hybrid Greek of Cappadocia, now under Ottoman rule. The names above ground change. Malakopi becomes Derinkuyu, Anaku becomes Kaymakla. The language of the administration switches from Greek to Turkish to Ottoman Turkish. But the habit persists. When the surface feels thin and unsafe, you thicken it by putting rock between yourself and the sky. We tend to imagine deep time as something that moves slowly, almost abstractly. Here it moves through very specific things. The reuse of a wine press, the smoke stain over an arch, the worn edge of a stair where feet have passed for perhaps 2.5 millennia, and then, unexpectedly, we step almost into living memory. In the early 20th century, a Cambridge linguist named Richard McGillivray Dawkins travelled through Cappadocia to study the local Greek dialects. He wasn't looking for ancient engineering. He was listening to how people spoke, what words they used, how their sentences bent. In one village, not Derinkuyu itself, but a nearby community, he heard a story that sounds like an echo from a much older world. In 1909, news reached Cappadocia of the Adana massacres, violent attacks on Armenian Christians hundreds of kilometres away. The details were probably confused and terrifying. Rumours rarely travel with clarity. What did travel was the sense that Christians were being killed, that something terrible had been unleashed. Dawkins records that in response, a great part of the population at Axo took refuge in these underground chambers, and for some nights did not venture to sleep above ground. Think about that timeline. By 1909, the Ottoman Empire is struggling with modernity, nationalism, foreign debt. Railways are cutting across Anatolia, telegraph lines are humming, cities like Istanbul and Smyrna are full of newspapers, cafes, electric lights. And in the volcanic heart of Cappadocia, when rumours of massacre arrived, people picked up lamps and blankets and went down stone stairs their ancestors had used in the days of iconoclast emperors and Arab raiders. They knew exactly where to go. They understood every feature, the stone doors, the air shafts, the logic of which families slept in which chamber. Nobody had to explain the concept of an underground refuge. The architecture was intuitive because it had been embedded in their culture for centuries. The last act comes quickly after that. In the 1910s and early 1920s, the Ottoman world imploded. Balkan Wars, the First World War, the Armenian Genocide, the Greco-Turkish War. Front lines flickered back and forth across Anatolia. In some areas, Christian communities again sought temporary safety in caves and underground complexes, but the machinery of modern state violence was harder to escape. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne formalized something unprecedented on this plateau, a compulsory population exchange between Greece and the new Republic of Turkey. Religion, not language, was the main criterion. Orthodox Christians in Anatolia, whether they spoke Turkish or Greek, were to be sent to Greece. Muslims in Greece were to be sent to Turkey. For the Cappadocian Greeks of Derinkuyu and the surrounding towns, this meant leaving not just their houses and fields, but their underground cities. You cannot put a multi-level rock-cut refuge on a cart. You can only walk away from it. With their departure, the living human link to Derinkuyu's defensive purpose was severed. Armenians had already been killed or driven out in earlier waves of violence. Now the remaining Christian communities were put on ships and trains. The underground cities, once communal tools of survival, became sealed basements in abandoned houses, then stories, then rumours. If the earliest phases of Derinkuyu really do stretch back into the Iron Age, then what we're looking at is perhaps 2,500, maybe even close to 2,800 years of intermittent use. Not continuous habitation, most of the time life was lived on the surface, but recurring episodes when different peoples, under different empires, pushed open the same hidden doors: Phrygian or Neo-Hittite farmers, Byzantine monks, Greek-speaking Christians under Arab raids, villagers under Seljuk Beys, Armenian craftsmen, Ottoman-era Cappadocian Greeks hearing about massacres on the telegraph line. All of them, at one time or another, made the same basic calculation. The surface has become lethal. We will disappear. What makes Derinkuyu so haunting is not just its scale. It's that every wave of users understood it immediately, no manual required. No inscription over the entrance saying, "In case of invasion, go here." The layout itself teaches you what it is for. Narrow corridors, choke points, communal spaces, deep wells. You step inside and your body knows this is a place to survive something. The faces changed, the prayers changed, the enemies changed from cavalry to muskets to artillery, from raiders to modern armies and mobs. The fear changed shape. But the response stayed remarkably constant. When the sky was kind, Derinkuyu was storage. When the sky darkened, it became a city. If Derinkuyu were a one-off, a single strange experiment in living under the earth, it would already be extraordinary. But it wasn't. When you step back from that one town, and from that one vertical maze of tunnels and chambers, a different picture emerges. Not a solitary city curled up in the dark, but an entire landscape honeycombed with hiding places. Archaeologists and local surveys talk about dozens or scores of underground cities. The numbers shift depending on how you define a city versus a cellar. More than 100, maybe up toward 200 underground settlements across Cappadocia. Of those, perhaps 30 or 40 are large enough and complex enough to be called true underground cities. Almost every historic village, it seems, had its own way of going below. Some are little more than a few rooms and a tunnel, a bolt hole for one extended family. Others spread laterally for hundreds of meters, or drop down level after level until the light from the entrance vanishes completely. Together they form one of the densest clusters of subterranean habitation anywhere on Earth. Derinkuyu is the deepest and most dramatic that we've explored so far. But just down the road, literally a short drive today, perhaps half a day's walk in the past, another city in the rock tells a slightly different story. Kaymaklı. On the surface, it looks like a quiet Anatolian town built over the ruins of earlier ones. Beneath it, the ground opens into a second world. 8 levels have been identified, 4 are commonly visited. Where Derinkuyu feels like a vertical spear driven into the tuff, Kaymaklı spreads wider, hugging the bedrock in low, sprawling galleries. Its design hints at a different emphasis. Near the surface, as in Derinkuyu, you find stables and a church. The spaces you needed access to first, for animals and worship, when a siege might last weeks rather than months. But as you move inward and downward, Kaymaklı starts to read like a warehouse, a workshop, and a pantry combined. Storage rooms cluster around central ventilation shafts. Amphora niches line the walls. Archaeologists have identified wineries, pressing areas, kitchens, and what looks like an industrial zone. There's an enormous block of andesite, harder than the surrounding tuff, used to cold-form copper. You can imagine the ringing echo of hammer-on metal in that confined space. If Derinkuyu is an emergency ark, engineered for maximum defensibility and endurance, Kaymaklı feels more like a communal basement, a place optimized not just for hiding, but for maintaining a village's economic life while hidden. Grain, wine, tools, metalwork. You don't just wait there, you keep working. Popular accounts in Cappadocia like to imagine a long tunnel, several kilometers in length, linking Derinkuyu and Kaymaklı. Some sections of tunnel between nearby complexes have been found. Whether there was ever a continuous, fully mapped corridor between these two giants is still uncertain. Archaeologists are cautious. The rock erodes, passages collapse, modern construction truncates old routes. But even the possibility tells you something about the mentality at work. These weren't isolated, paranoid households burrowing alone. They were communities who, over generations, learned to think about safety in terms of networks. One refugee per settlement. In some cases, perhaps, refuges link to each other, and Derinkuyu and Kaymaklı are only the largest, most famous nodes in this web. To the north, near Avanos, lies Uskunak. It stayed hidden until the 1970s, when a farmer noticed his irrigation water disappearing into the earth. Tracing the loss, he stumbled onto a complex cut into the volcanic rock, with multiple levels and a familiar catalogue of rooms, stables, kitchens, storage spaces, stone doors. But Özkonak added twists of its own. Its builders carved narrow communication channels between levels, pipe-like holes that let defenders shout or listen without opening the main corridors. Alongside the ventilation shafts, they cut small vertical passages aligned with the stone doors, maybe to pour boiling water or oil down on attackers if those outer doors were forced. Derinkuyu has its great circular stones. Kaymaklı has its copper working block. Özkonak has its whisper tubes and murder holes. Each city solves the same problem, but with different local innovations. Elsewhere you find Mazi, Tatlarin, and a scatter of other named and unnamed complexes. Some specialize in wine production, with elaborate presses carved into the floor. Others cluster religious spaces close together. Chapels, carved crosses, baptismal fonts, suggesting monastic presence or heavy ecclesiastical influence. Many reuse earlier rock-cut tombs, folding the dead of previous centuries into new defensive architectures. You start to realize that underground Cappadocia is not just a few tourist sites, it is an entire cultural layer. And that layer is not confined to pure survival spaces. Drive or walk toward Göreme, and the same stone that swallowed whole villages for safety opens up in a different way. Here, the volcanic cliffs and fairy chimneys are riddled with churches, chapels and monasteries rather than deep vertical shafts. The Göreme Open Air Museum feels almost like a town where the houses are prayers. You have multi-story monastic complexes, refectories with long stone tables carved straight from the wall, kitchens blackened by centuries of smoke, dormitories and cells, storerooms and cloisters, all inside the tuff. Narrow stairs wind between stories. Windows cut high in the rock let in a soft filtered light. And then there are the churches. Tokalı, Göreme. You can start to see Cappadocia from the inside out. This wasn't a region with one dramatic response to one particular crisis. It was a place where, for at least 2.5 millennia, going into the rock became a normal part of life. Sometimes that meant a small cellar-like refuge for a few nights during a raid. Sometimes it meant whole towns vanishing for weeks. Sometimes it meant a monastery hewn into a cliff, where the insecurity answered was not political but spiritual, the chaos of the soul, the desire to escape sin and distraction. From Hittite or Neo-Hittite principalities in the late Bronze and early Iron Age, through Persian, Hellenistic, Roman and Byzantine rule, through Seljuk Beyliks and Ottoman provinces, the cast of characters changed but the gestures stayed familiar. Raiders on horseback, tax collectors, Arab armies probing the frontier, steppe empires sweeping through, bandits in the hills, periodic famine and drought. For people who lived generation after generation at the crossroads of empires, insecurity was not an exception. It was the baseline. The rock became the counterweight. Instead of building massive stone walls on the surface, Cappadocians thickened their world vertically. They dug down, they spread sideways, they turned the landscape itself into an ally. From a distance, the region can look like empty badlands dotted with fairy chimneys and a few villages. From within, you realize you're moving across the roof of a second geography, invisible unless you know where to look. And even now, we don't know where to look, not completely. New underground spaces are still being discovered in the 20th and 21st centuries. A farmer's water vanishes and reveals Özkonak. Construction for a new building exposes a hidden chamber under a modern street. Local rumours of old caves led survey teams to previously unrecorded complexes. Even the famous sites are not exhausted. Derinkuyu and Kaymaklı have sealed passages, unexplored side corridors, hints of levels that may continue beyond what's currently mapped. Safety concerns, modern buildings above, and the sheer labour required to clear and stabilise these voids mean that large parts of this subterranean world remain in darkness. Popular imagination likes to turn the darkness into a single coherent mega-network, a labyrinth of tunnels linking every city to every other. The evidence so far points to something more modest and in a way more human. Clusters of locally connected refuges, built and rebuilt over centuries, tailored to specific communities' needs, with some longer links and shared traditions stitching them together. The full pattern may never be completely traced. Too many passages have collapsed. Too many entrances lie under modern houses or roads or fields. In some sense, the mystery is now part of the story. What we can say is that Derinkuyu was not alone. It was one intense point in a much larger constellation of underground life. A constellation shaped by the same pressures that sent the Cambridge linguists' informants into the Earth in 1909, and their Iron Age predecessors into the Earth 2,000 years before that. An entire region learned the same lesson. When the surface cannot be trusted, you carve your trust into stone, which brings us back to the question that has been lurking under all of this. If so many people, for so long, were willing to abandon the open sky and build second lives in the dark, what exactly were they so afraid of? And were they right? If you ask an archaeologist what the people of Derinkuyu were hiding from, you don't get a single word. You get a timeline. The safest answer, the one anchored to inscriptions, chronicles, and layers of ashen pottery, is that Derinkuyu and its sister cities were built and rebuilt in response to very ordinary human threats. Armies, tax collectors, raiders, neighbours. In the Middle Byzantine period, when a lot of Derinkuyu's deeper levels seem to have taken their final form, Cappadocia sat on the seam between worlds. To the west, Constantinople and the empire that called itself Roman. To the south and east, Arab caliphates and frontier emirates. For centuries the border wobbled back and forth across Anatolia like a loose stitch. When you read the chronicles, the pattern is wearying. Raids from Syria into Cappadocia, counter-raids from Cappadocia into Syria, villages burned, prisoners taken, churches stripped. In between those headline conflicts, you had bandits working the same roads that caravans used to carry silk, spices and tax revenues. Derinkuyu's architecture makes sense in that world. Narrow corridors designed so that only one or two people can pass at a time. Heavy stone doors that can be rolled shut from the inside, levels that can be sealed independently, so that even if an enemy took the first or second floor, the people deeper down might still be safe. This isn't the logic of apocalypse, it's the logic of siege. You retreat with your family, your animals, your grain. You close the doors, you wait until the danger passes or moves on. A few days, a few weeks. Maybe, in the worst campaigns, a season. And Derinkuyu was used like this again and again, by Christian communities in the early Byzantine centuries, hiding from pagan raids and local conflicts. By Christians again in the 7th to 11th centuries, when Arab armies pushed north and west, probing the plateau. Later, when the Mongols surged into Anatolia in the 13th century, there are traditions of people vanishing underground as the horsemen approached. Even in the late Ottoman period and the early 20th century, during waves of ethnic violence and population transfers, Cappadocian Greeks and Armenians remembered and reused some of these spaces, not continuously, not as permanent cities, but as a recurring option. When in doubt, go below. If you stop there, the fear behind Derinkuyu is familiar. It's the same fear that builds fortified walls, watchtowers and castles on hills. The difference is just direction. Elsewhere, people built up. Here, they learn to build down. But there are other layers to the story. Some researchers point out that Cappadocia is not only a crossroads of empires, but a region living close to the edge of environmental comfort. Summers can be hot and dry. Winters can be hard. Over the last few thousand years, climate records from lakes and cave deposits in Anatolia show pulses of drought, periods when rainfall dropped and crops would have struggled. In times like that, the line between raid and famine strategy gets blurry. If your harvest fails, and the next valley's harvest fails, and there are no imperial granaries nearby to even things out, then violence can become a way of redistributing scarcity. Communities under stress steal food, livestock, and people. Now imagine you're a farming village on that plateau. You've had a couple of lean years. You know there are armed men on the roads, imperial soldiers, rebels, bandits. It hardly matters to the wheat. You also know that the cool volcanic rock under your feet is a perfect place to store grain and wine. Stable temperature, protected from fire, protected from casual theft. Suddenly digging down isn't just about hiding people. It's about hiding calories. Those long, low storage rooms you saw in Keimaklu, clustered around ventilation shafts, the amphora niches lining the walls, the wineries inside the rock. They look less like a wartime emergency and more like a comprehensive insurance policy against a world in which climate, empire, and human greed are all unreliable. The underground cities in this reading are not only anti-army, they are anti-famine. They let you ride out the double blow of conflict and crop failure with your food and your family intact. In a dry year, the person with a cool underground granary has a better chance of surviving than the person with sacks in a wooden shed. So maybe what they were hiding from was not just soldiers, but the compound crisis of bad weather plus bad politics. And then, beneath those historically grounded explanations, there are the stories that swirl around any place that feels too large for ordinary hands. Derinkuyu, with its estimates of room for tens of thousands of people, its deep ventilation shaft dropping 50 meters like an artificial canyon, its rumor-haunted tunnels that vanish into darkness. This is exactly the kind of place that attracts stranger theories. You'll find claims that it was built by a vanished pre-Ice Age civilization, or as a shelter from a solar storm, a comet, a pole shift. In some versions, it's a bunker left by ancient astronauts who either dug it themselves or taught humans how. These ideas are popular because they're cinematic. They offer a single, dramatic answer to the question, what were they so afraid of? Something big enough to scare the whole planet. Something worthy of such a colossal effort. But when you look closely at the evidence, the extraordinary dissolves into the very human. The tool marks on the walls match iron and later steel chisels, not exotic technology. The pottery, coins, and graffiti you find in the fill layers belong to well-known Anatolian cultures. Hellenistic, Roman, Byzantine, medieval. The iconography in the chapels is thoroughly Christian and tracks stylistic changes we can date to within a century or two. Nothing in the stratigraphy requires a lost timeline. Nothing in the engineering demands knowledge beyond what the local masons already had from carving churches and houses into the same rock. The scale is startling, but it's an understandable extrapolation from things we know these societies could and did do. Take a rock-cut cellar, multiply it by generations of expansion, add the pressure of recurring wars. You don't need aliens, you need time, chisels, and reasons. Still, there's a deeper kind of explanation that doesn't show up in pottery typologies or climate graphs. Call it architectural anxiety. If you grow up in a region where your grandparents can point to the cave where they hid from raiders, and your parents can tell you about the year the soldiers came through and everyone slept in the tunnels, you inherit more than a floor plan. You inherit a habit of mind. You learn that the surface is conditional. Green fields, bright houses, open courtyards, they are the daytime face of life. But the real guarantee of survival lies in the stone beneath. You are always, in some quiet part of your thinking, building for the day when everything goes wrong. So you don't just dig enough space for this season's danger. You imagine slightly worse dangers, a bigger army, a longer siege, a harder winter. You add another corridor, another storage room, another level. You thicken doors. You make the well deeper, the ventilation more cunning. Over centuries, that mindset can turn a simple refuge into a city, not because any one generation faced the ultimate catastrophe, but because every generation expected that something bad, or worse than last time, was bound to come. Better safe than sorry becomes a stone architecture. From this angle, the paradox in our title, the idea that something unimaginably terrifying must have driven people underground, starts to soften. Maybe there was no single nightmare, no one great event that sent an entire population fleeing into the earth and staying there forever. Instead, there was the slow, grinding accumulation of many lesser nightmares. A raid here, a drought there, a failed revolt, a tax hike, a bandit gang, an army on the horizon, decades of quiet, then another crisis, each one leaving its own faint groove in the rock. The fear that carved Derinkuyu might not have been spectacular. It might have been chronic. Anxiety as a climate, not a storm. And this is where the mystery settles in, quietly, and refuses to move. We can line up the big wars on a timeline. We can point to climate records and say, here, this century looks dry, this one wetter. We can date a chapel by the style of Christ's eyes in a fresco. But we cannot, with any real certainty, name the night when the first family in Derinkuyu decided to take a hammer and a chisel and cut a tunnel just a little deeper than anyone had before. Was it after a neighbour was taken captive? After a harvest failed? After a rumour of approaching horsemen? Was it a calm decision, planned over months, or a frantic deepening of an existing cellar as smoke rose on the horizon? We don't know. What we have instead is the result. A structure big enough to hold a town, intricate enough to suggest centuries of refinement, and ordinary enough in its details, kitchens, wine presses, stables, that you can still feel the everyday life it sheltered. The absence of a single origin story is part of what keeps Derinkuyu so compelling. It invites you to imagine, to assemble in your mind all those little fears and reasonable precautions into something that, when finished, looks almost unreasonable in its scale. When you picture yourself there standing in one of those narrow corridors, fingers brushing the grooves left by ancient tools, you're touching a record of layered worries and layered hopes. They were not just hiding from enemies, they were hiding for their children, for their grain, for their stories, for the possibility of a future in a landscape that never quite let them relax. And underneath the scholarship, the climate charts, and the dismissed alien hypotheses, that might be the most durable answer. They were hiding from a world that had taught them again and again that safety is never guaranteed, unless you carve it out yourself. For a place born out of centuries of quiet fear, Derinkuyu's disappearance was almost too ordinary. In the early 20th century, as empires broke and borders hardened, the last Greek families of Cappadocia left in the population exchange between Greece and the new Turkish Republic. The underground city that had been their emergency refuge, their ancestral fallback plan, lost its storytellers. Entrances were walled up. Houses shifted hands. Children grew up hearing rumours of old caves beneath the town, but the continuous line of memory frayed and snapped. For a few decades, Derinkuyu wasn't a secret in the dramatic sense. It was more like a misfiled document. Everyone knew the land here was hollow in some vague, inherited way. No one quite remembered the index. Then, in 1963, a man in the modern town of Derinkuyu decided to do some renovation. The story, which has been repeated so often it has taken on the feel of legend, goes like this. He knocked through a wall in his house, perhaps to make room for a new storage area, perhaps simply to straighten a crooked corner, and instead of bare rock or his neighbour's plaster, he found a void, a narrow passage, cool air, a darkness that absorbed the beam of his flashlight instead of reflecting it. He had, unknowingly, broken back into a world that had been sealed off since his grandparents' time, A buried neighborhood, a fossilized escape route. Word spread. Local officials called in archaeologists. As they cleared debris and old collapses, the scale of what lay under the town slowly revealed itself, level after level, rooms branching off corridors, stairways dropping into the rock, the familiar signatures of stables and kitchens and churches appearing again under the dust. By 1969, a portion of the complex had been stabilized and open to visitors. What had been a last resort for Byzantine peasants became a destination for tourists in shorts, following a guide with a flashlight. Today, Derinkuyu is folded into a wider protected landscape, Gurem National Park and the rock sites of Cappadocia. On UNESCO lists, it appears as one of several subterranean cities that help define this region, a component of a cultural ecosystem of valleys, fairy chimneys, cliff-cut churches and underground towns. But only a fraction of it is accessible. Guides will tell you there are 8 main levels open to the public, reaching perhaps 50 or 60 meters below the surface. Local officials and surveys hint at more, maybe 18 levels in total, dropping down towards 80 meters, with side passages still blocked by safety barriers or simply left in darkness, unexplored. In a way, modern regulations have recreated a softer version of the old secrecy. There are known zones and unknown zones, places you can go and places where the answer is still not yet. If you visit, the experience is strangely intimate and physical. You start at a wide entrance, where the outside light still reaches and the air smells of dust and sunscreen and coffee from the bus park. Then you step into a tunnel, and the world shrinks. The ceilings drop. The walls press in until you're moving shoulder to shoulder with strangers. You feel the rock brushing your arms. You have to bend your head in some places, walk sideways in others. The coolness becomes noticeable, a relief from summer heat, but also a reminder that you're entering a different environment, stable, insulated, indifferent to weather. The deeper you go, the more your senses adjust. Voices sound different underground, softer and yet more immediate. Your breathing becomes something you listen to. The ventilation shafts, still doing their job after more than a millennium, feed you air that is surprisingly fresh, but you're always aware that it is being channeled, managed, rationed through stone. For some people, especially those prone to claustrophobia, this is the point where the rational brain starts doing quiet calculations. How many meters of rock are above me? How long until I can see the sky again? For others, there is a different unease, a ghost of someone else's urgency. You look at a rolling stone door and it stops being an exhibit. It becomes a question. What did it feel like to close this in anger or panic, knowing that the world outside had become hostile? Tourism brochures talk about Derinkuyu as a marvel of ancient engineering, and it is that. But it is also, even now, an emotional machine. It shapes the way you feel as you move through it. And if you step back from your own reaction and look at the broader world, you notice something unsettling. We like to think we've moved beyond this. We tell ourselves that people who dug cities underground were reacting to a rougher age. Raiders on horseback, empires at war, famines, plagues. We have satellites and early warning systems. We can see storms forming half a world away. We launch telescopes into space. Surely we have outgrown the need to hide in the earth. Then you look at a different kind of map, a map of Cold War fallout shelters. The honeycomb of bunkers dug into mountains in the 1950s and 60s, stocked with canned food and water drums in case of nuclear war. Government command centres buried under hundreds of meters of rock. Quiet basements in suburbs, reinforced and filled with supplies, just in case. You read about decommissioned missile silos in the American Midwest converted into luxury compounds, complete with swimming pools and theatres, marketed to those who can afford to pre-purchase safety. You look at recent reports of tech billionaires buying land in remote areas, building semi-subterranean villas with panic rooms and private airstrips, contracts for custom bunkers with filtered air systems, hydroponic gardens and biometric doors. You scroll past online forums where doomsday preppers share blueprints for hidden cellars, lists of shelf-stable foods, diagrams of air filtration. The threats they imagine have changed the vocabulary: nuclear winter, pandemics, climate collapse, social breakdown. But the chosen direction of retreat is familiar: down. The instinct to go under when the world feels unstable never disappeared. It just learned new materials, reinforced concrete instead of volcanic tuff, HEPA filters instead of carved shafts. There's a revealing contrast here. Derinkuyu was a communal technology. Its passages, kitchens, water sources and storerooms were dug for entire villages, multiple families, strangers who would become neighbours in the dark. Its design assumes shared risk and shared refuge. Many modern bunkers are individual solutions, private answers to collective problems. You and your family behind your door with your supplies. That's not a moral judgment so much as a mirror. What we fear and how we respond is a kind of X-ray of our social world. Derinkuyu shows a community that thought in terms of we when it planned for catastrophe. Our high-end bunkers often reveal how often we think in terms of I. There is another assumption that Derinkuyu quietly inverts. We're used to drawing a simple line between ancient and modern, as if intelligence and sophistication increase steadily, like a rising graph. Caves belong on one end, skyscrapers on the other. But when you stand in a chamber 5 stories underground, feeling a breeze that's been pulled through a 50-meter shaft, flowing evenly without smoke, you realize that hierarchy is less clear. These people, whoever began the work and whoever finished it, created a self-regulating microclimate beneath the earth. The tuff holds temperature steady. The shafts modulate air. Water is accessible through a deep well that in some sections could be reached only from inside the defensible core of the city. They laid out stables near entrances so that animals and their smells stayed near the surface. They put living quarters deeper in, around central circulation routes. They carved chapels, schools, wineries, storage. They understood crowding, sanitation, the need for separate spaces for different activities. Engineers today still study Cappadocia's rock-cut architecture for lessons in passive insulation and structural stability. Derinkuyu isn't a curiosity from a primitive age. It is a complex system solution created with hammers, chisels, and generational memory. If anything, it asks an awkward question. We build higher and higher, towers of glass, orbital stations, planned colonies on Mars. We send our ambitions upward, literally aiming for the sky. Yet, when we are most afraid, our first architectural instinct is still to reverse direction, to burrow, to hide. Humans carry both impulses. We raise monuments to be seen, to declare presence, to celebrate the idea that we have mastered our environment, and we carve refuges to be unseen, to admit that we have not. The surface is where we perform civilization. The subsurface is where we quietly concede our vulnerability. In Cappadocia, those two realms exist almost on top of one another. Sunlit rock spires and hillside churches above, multi-level shadow worlds below. They are not contradictions, they are a pair. Derinkuyu, especially in its tourist life, lets you feel that duality in your own body. You spend the morning walking past open valleys and bright frescoes, and the afternoon ducking into a slit in the ground, descending into a space designed not to impress but to protect. And then you come back up. You emerge into light, blinking, the wind suddenly on your face again, car engines and bird calls and the smell of warm dust all rushing back at once. It feels like waking from a long, oddly detailed dream. Behind you, the entrance remains. People line up, one group going down as another comes up like breaths through a throat cut into the earth. Deeper inside, beyond where tourists are allowed, there are still corridors that end in rockfalls, doors that haven't been moved in a century, side rooms where no modern voice echoes. The oil lamps are gone, the hearths are cold. No one grinds grain on those floors anymore. No child curls up against that particular wall waiting for the all clear. But the stone remembers. It remembers the vibration of metal against its surface, stroke after stroke after stroke. It remembers the footfalls of people carrying water, the muffled thud of doors being rolled into place, the murmur of prayers spoken not for show, but for survival. When you lie in bed later, far away, listening to this story in the dark, you're joining that memory in a small way. You're descending in imagination where others once descended in fear. The city is quiet now, its chambers are mostly empty. Its purpose as an active refuge has passed. Yet in its silence, in the curves of its tunnels and the careful cut of its air shafts, you can still feel the echo of a very old decision. When the world becomes uncertain, we will carve a place to endure it. Fear is usually something we talk about as weakness. We say people were driven by fear when we want to explain cruelty, panic, bad decisions. We imagine courage as the opposite of fear, as if bravery means not feeling afraid at all. But when you look at Derinkuyu, really look at it, not as a tourist attraction, but as the sum of thousands of quiet decisions over more than 1,000 years, you start to see a different pattern. Here, fear and creativity are not opposites. They're partners. The story begins long before the first corridor was carved. First, there was fire, on a scale humans had nothing to do with. Millions of years ago, Cappadocia was a landscape of erupting volcanoes. Layers of ash and lava settled, compressed, and transformed into tuff, soft enough to carve with hand tools, strong enough to stand in thick blocks for centuries without collapsing, stable enough to hold a staircase spiraling down 50, maybe 80 meters. The rock did not know it was future architecture. It was just the afterlife of eruptions. Then came people, not the particular villagers who expanded Derinkuyu in the Byzantine period, but their deep ancestors, the same long line that passed through that brutal genetic bottleneck almost 1 million years ago. Tiny, scattered human groups who learned the hard way that survival depends on 2 things, cooperation and remembering. They didn't know anything about Cappadocia, but they carried, in their genes and in their cultures, a lesson that would matter here later. If you want your descendants to live, you plan for bad times even during the good ones. Fast forward to Iron Age Anatolia. The volcanic landscape is no longer just geology. It's a strategic crossroads. Empires rise and fall around it. Hittite, Neo-Hittite, Phrygian, Persian. Armies move through the plateaus and valleys. Frontier villages live with a very specific kind of fear, not of the earth cracking open, but of hoofbeats on the horizon, of tax collectors, conscription, slave raiders, the anonymous violence of someone else's war. Somewhere in that churn, people in this region notice an opportunity hidden inside their anxiety. The tuff around them is easy to cut. They already carve storage rooms, rock-cut houses, maybe early tunnels. At some point, exactly when is still debated, someone takes the next step. Not just a cellar, not just a cave, a connected system. A retreat that isn't just a hole in the ground, but a plan. They start digging. By the time Byzantine chroniclers were writing about Arab raids in the 7th and 8th centuries, that plan had become an underground city. Maybe not the full 18 levels some surveys now suggest, but a deep layered refuge with ventilation shafts, wells, stables, kitchens, churches, storage rooms, sleeping spaces. Each new threat carved a little more fear into the rock and a little more ingenuity. You can read the psychology in the layout. narrow, twisting corridors where only 1 or 2 people can pass at a time, not an accident. It slows invaders, lets defenders hold a choke point. Stone doors weighing hundreds of kilos, shaped like millstones but with small holes in the centre. From the outside, nearly impossible to grip. From the inside, a bar or pole through that hole gives leverage to roll the door aside. Easy to close, hard to force. Levels that can be sealed off separately. If attackers break into one tier, families can retreat further down, closing themselves behind another circle of stone, another turn in the tunnel. It's a vertical series of last chances. All of it tells you what its builders feared most, not earthquakes, not famine, other humans. And yet, wrapped around that fear is something softer. Stables near the surface so animals don't have to descend far. Wineries carved into deeper levels, a schoolroom, chapels with carved crosses on the walls, long low spaces where grain could be stored dry and cool for months. These aren't the features of a mere panic hole, they're the infrastructure of continuity, a community that expects to need refuge not for a night, but for weeks, maybe months, and intends to emerge afterwards still itself, still speaking the same language, telling the same stories, teaching the same prayers. Fear sets the problem. Creativity solves it. We often talk about fight or flight as if those are the only options. Derinkuyu shows a third: prepare, build, turn dread into architecture. And what's striking is how anonymous that achievement is. We know the names of emperors who sent armies across this plateau. We can list kings, sultans, generals, warlords. Their decisions helped create the very dangers that sent villagers underground. But we don't know who designed the first ventilation shaft here. We don't know who figured out that a shaft could double as a well, or who first realized that if you put animals on upper levels and people below, you could manage air quality and noise better. No inscriptions proclaim, "I so-and-so ordered the digging of this level." No statues of master builders stand at the entrances. Derinkuyu is pure collective authorship. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people, over many generations, each adding a corridor, carving out a new room, improving a drainage channel, passing on knowledge of which veins of tuff are stable and which might crumble. The city is a palimpsest of unrecorded decisions. We don't see their faces. We don't know their individual stories, their jokes, their arguments.